Quite some time ago, Ilse asked me to speak today for a brief time around elder rights, because it is the World Elder Abuse Day, and it really struck me that it's important to highlight the obvious in talking about elder rights, that elder rights are human rights. So human rights, of course, are for all people, all humans. They're regardless of age, how much money you have, your gender, your disability, sexuality, ethnicity, faith. It's the reason we highlight specific groups like that, like we do with when we really call out elder rights in discussing human rights in general, is because there's been specific treaties even created around specific groups of people that are beyond the original Bill of Rights, things like the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and treaties that serve to seek to eradicate discrimination against women and racial discrimination. It's really to highlight that there are specific people and groups of people who are still experiencing barriers that need to be addressed so that they can enjoy their human rights on an equal basis with everybody else. So none of these treaties, or referring to a thing that we've called elder rights, none of these things create new or different rights that aren't there for all humans. We've all got the same rights, and these are based on principles outlined in the original Declaration of Human Rights. So elder rights, it sounds obvious, I'll just put my screen up, are human rights. And I think that's as good a place to any to start. We've certainly learned about what a human rights lens has achieved in areas like disability after the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities came into place. Everything is not perfect in that space, which we know because of we're seeing things throughout the Disability Royal Commission. However, it's a very different space than it was 20 to 30 years ago, where there were really normalised and totally accepted quite horrific institutions where things like the sexual abuse of women and girls with disabilities, particularly with intellectual disabilities, was considered really awful, but really kind of just the way things are. And back then there was no real sense that these women deserved to be able to access even just the basic mainstream health services such as victim support or sexual health that other women in the community were offered. And if you really just stop and think about that, it's alarming to think. The question is why? Why was it so normalised that really good people and well-meaning charities and faith-based organisations who had institutions that were supporting people with disabilities, why was it so normalised that they didn't call in the troops to support these women just like other women in the community would be offered? Why is that so? Today, I believe, I really strongly believe that people living with cognitive disabilities, particularly as they grow older or receive a dementia diagnosis, they're really the final bastion, the final hurdle that we have to jump in terms of elder rights, in terms of that really casual and normalised discrimination and denial of basic human rights, denial of basic decision making that has been so normalised. And I think that day is really rapidly approaching in residential aged care. And I believe that everyone is just beginning to get their heads around what a human rights framework might really mean, a consistent, codified human rights framework and underpinning a new Aged Care Act, what that will actually mean in practice. And I think that whatever's happening right now and that we're getting to will definitely become the new aged care in Australia. I'm sure all of you've noticed that almost everything in the space is being framed around human rights, around the rights of older people. And it's that human rights lens that's really giving people those bumping moments, that's really shedding light on and reframing things that were almost invisible and just completely accepted before, those violations that just so normalised. I was actually speaking with some professional colleagues not that long ago around a case that they'd recently come across around a woman who was sexually assaulted in residential aged care, and how difficult it was to engage the police, and there was nowhere for the perpetrator to go. So these two people were living still under the same roof. And of course, in disability, it would just be standard practice that there would be a guard 24 hours a day in a situation like that, keeping that older woman safe and making sure that older man was not assaulting anybody else. But in aged care, getting to that is like almost a hurdle in terms of mainstreaming in reference to inviting all of those other mainstream health services and social services into the space, into this currently still pretty closed institution. But the general public now, the media, peak bodies, they're all framing anything they come across in terms of human rights. And that's interesting because that framing makes all the difference. And this is a very new concept in aged care. I'm not sure if we discussed this last time, but even the Royal Commission into aged care, the commissioners themselves operated with a kind of unconscious bias, which was really evident in that interim report of the Royal Commission, where, and Professor Andrew Burns highlighted this, where you had an interim report that spoke about this shocking tale of neglect and abuse, and how these were terrible, and that older people deserved better and we should care about them more. And then when it got to younger people living with disabilities in residential aged care, it immediately changed tone, and it drew on international codified law, such as in a few treaties like the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities and their right to live in the community. But just framing these in terms of human rights was completely different to how older people living with a whole range of disabilities in residential aged care, whether that's sensory, mobility, cognitive, a whole lot of disabilities, it's framed in that care frame. Again, that's really really similar. This whole thing that we're going through is very similar to what happened in disability 20 to 30 years ago, that long held thinking and operating in that old kind of charity or really medical, best interest kind of a framework. It just completely hit a wall with the introduction of human rights. And managers in that space were just so busy trying to catch up with changes in regulations, and they were just going around in circles trying to make their existing systems fit this new rights-based paradigm. They were so busy doing that they couldn't actually see the complexity and enormity of that paradigm shift that was required looking through, excuse me, a rights-based lens. And so in terms of elder rights and the introduction of rights-based approaches into aged care, excuse me, there's probably some learnings that we can take from the disability space, things to keep in mind as we keep coming across all of these relentless kind of changes and expectations. Remembering that managers working in that space started to sort of think, right, what can we do to comply? We'll just create sort of more tick box and more layer even more forms and processes on top of the countless amounts of existing ones. Many just kept insisting, well, we're already doing that. Or understanding, yep, I understand human rights, we've been doing it for years, but they couldn't see that they were so firmly stuck into that, in that old way of thinking and operating, trying to keep up with the proposed changes. It was that best interest paradigm, that kind of charity approach. They were stuck there totally without even being aware that they were there. And those were the kind of attitudes that were rampant in disability 20, 30 years ago. But the disability field has changed, as we said. It couldn't exist in that old previous way of thinking and working, and neither will aged care and supporting older people under a rights framework. Fundamental reform requires fundamental reform at that foundational, operational and philosophical level, and that really requires creative, thoughtful, ethical responses to the external challenges and changes. I really believe that we're going to be shaking our heads in disbelief soon about some of the things that even today are really normalised. And I mean in the not too distant future, in areas such as just the unquestioned substitute decision making and the really casual overriding and dismissal of decision making of older people. Again, we're seeing these framed as human rights. We're going to continue heading down that path with the Rights-Based Act, and it's kind of that ship has sailed. And I think that individual organisations will be judged by their engagement with and commitment to human rights. I actually think people's reputations will depend on it. So what are human rights is something I thought I'd introduce really briefly to underpin what are the human rights of all people, what are the principles that underpin that. So this is from the Australian Human Rights Commission. Human rights recognise the inherent value of each person, regardless of background, where we live, what we look like, what we think or what we believe, including people living with cognitive disabilities and older people with cognitive disabilities that come with things like dementia. They're based on principles of dignity, equality and mutual respect, which are shared across cultures, religions and philosophies. They're about being treated fairly, treating others fairly, and having the right to make an ability to make genuine choices in our day-to-day lives. So these are based on sort of the Declaration of Human Rights, and these, when nations like Australia sign on, they're not binding. But the treaties that were based on these Declaration of Human Rights, they are binding, and Australia is signatory to many of them. There's a whole range of them you can see here. Covenants on civil and political rights, economic, social, as we said before, ones that seek to eradicate racial discrimination, discrimination against women, ones against torture and other cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment. Conventions specifically looking after that group we know as children, and ones that specifically focus on the rights of people living with disabilities, and the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. There's a lot of work internationally in developing a Charter of Rights for older people. But for this group of people that we're talking about, particularly people who are living in residential aged care, they wouldn't be living there unless they were experiencing one or more types of disabilities that are covered under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And in fact, the World Health Organization said that dementia specifically comes under the CRPD, and that organizations and countries who are supporting people with dementia need to base their staff training, their policies and their practices around the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So just to highlight again, those articles, those treaties that look after specific groups, they don't introduce new rights. Rights of people with disabilities are human rights that all people share. But these conventions specifically address roadblocks and barriers that these groups of people face in terms of having their rights respected. So the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, its principles really highlight some of the areas that need focus when we're working with older people living with a range of intellectual and cognitive disabilities. And some of the key, I think, revolutions and really important parts of the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities is that it really, even though the original declaration and all the others say that human rights are for all people, the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities really highlights the diversity perspective in terms of the diversity of our humanness. We're not all of a certain age, male, white, and really, really healthy. That short time frame in anybody's life is getting rapidly shorter, especially with an aging population. It's to say we come in all different shapes and sizes and abilities and capacities, but all of those people, all of them make up part of the human family. And that's really, really important, because that forms the basis of the claims for rights around discrimination based on the social model, saying that it isn't the diversity of humanity, it's the problem. It's the problem of society in accepting these people as fellow humans and having systems and organizations and institutions that recognizes them as fellow human beings, first and foremost, with equal rights and equal access to the human rights that everyone shares. So particularly, as you can imagine, that focus on personhood is vital in the support of people with dementia, of course, and also even in law. There's some other articles of the CRPD. We don't have time to go through them today, but thinking about them in terms of residential aged care is actually really helpful. Some of the key ones highlight obviously the right to life, but then coming under the right to life is a whole lot of considerations of things we do now that are taken for granted that actually don't privilege people's lives, that put them at risk. Things like unnecessary medication and overuse of psychotropics, for example. This idea of liberty and security of person, and also, you know, freedom to live in the community as well, of course, is really coming into loggerheads with institutions and the idea of deinstitutionalization, and in particular desegregation, even within aged care homes, in terms of having dementia specific areas and places people can't go. But even looking at Article 28 on the most basic level in terms of an adequate standard of living, just looking at the things that come under that around access to water in all areas, including dementia-specific areas. You know, are you going to walk into a dementia area and then another area of the home, and they're going to be different in terms of the quality of the food, the quality of the cutlery, how clean it is, those types of things. The idea that these environments can kind of be surfacey clean, but just filled with signs that the people who live there don't care. Notice boards full of notices that are unevenly placed, blue tack on walls. The idea that people in these spaces have their clothing taken off them sometimes. I remember, and I think I may even be guilty of it many years ago, you know, where people just grab people's clothing and that's not labelled, so they just grab a texture and write their name on it, on their clothing that they wear in a place that is actually viewable by other humans. All of the types of things that, a lot of things that are taken for granted. People's access to get new clothing once they move in, not wear other people's, not wear clothing that's torn or looks poorly ironed or laundered. All of those things around dignity that are really codified, particularly in conventions like the CRPD. So we've discussed the importance of Article 12, and we don't have time to go into it today, but it really codifies the right to not have substitute decision making, to have supported decision making regimes, and that even when support is offered to people, it's not offered on a best interest basis. It's offered so that everyone is focusing on working out what that person wants now. And that works. It doesn't say human rights unless they don't have dementia or unless they use language. The kind of attention that's required to find out people's will and preferences is the support that the CRPD and Article 12 demands in terms of supporting people to make decision making. It's not just grabbing two people and calling that supported decision making. It's two people focused on what that person wants right now. And the only even outside consideration that express preference would be even dreamed of being overruled by others is if there was a severe and imminent risk to the safety of a resident or to somebody else. So the kind of way that this plays out in terms of internal policies is having to have a commitment to expressing people's current will and preferences, as the Australian Law Reform Commission says. So that's not somebody saying, oh, mum used to do this or do that. That's like saying, this isn't a person now. It's not recognition of this human now. It's saying, we're going to make mum do something that what we consider was a human 20 years ago. So it's about what this current person is willing and desiring and expressing. So commitment to respecting the current will and preferences. And if you really think about that, the word current is a bit of a game changer in this space. Commitment to respecting verbal and non-verbal expressions of will and preference equally. So that, think about what you're going to need to set up in terms of your staff surveys and your assessment and evaluations in terms of just the reasonable accommodations required to support their engagement, not just having proxy there. When it appears that a person's capacity to make or express decisions is impaired, then the organisation must utilise supported decision-making, giving effect to the resident's current will and preferences. And it's the current will of a resident that is a measure of their self-determination, and so it's a matter of human rights that this be upheld. Decision-making powers used only for the purpose they're allowed under law, and it's, again, still giving effect to the resident's current will and preferences, and really clarifying that difference between things that present a real imminent risk to people's life and things that decisions any of us would expect to be able to make in our day-to-day lives without our families saying it's okay or without clinical sanction. So I'm going to end this section of it and hand it over to the chat in the limited time that we have left. If anyone has got absolutely anything to contribute or to say or to write in the chat around what we've shared today around elder rights and where the rubber meets the road in terms of how they're experienced in a residential aged care setting.